Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're waiting for a few more participants to join and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. Commissioners, I am now turning on the ability to start your audio and video.
I don't think I've ever seen Ethan look so much as a air traffic controller.
I'll try to bring in all the planes safely, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I got to tell you, the audio on that is crystal clear. It is just extraordinarily vibrant. So congratulations, Carl.
Thank you.
It's, of course, always a pleasure to see the commissioners. Long time no see. I don't know if you believe me or not, but I do think about you from time to time, and I do miss our lively conversations and the work that we do at these meetings. So welcome everybody again.
Mr. Chairman, I was wondering if you're catering lunch today. I was waiting for a knock on my door, but I haven't heard it yet.
Yeah, it's probably one of those. Since we're talking about organic waste recycling, you might not want to take a bite of that pizza. So it's 3 minutes after 12, and I think we have enough of our commissioners present, so we can go ahead and start. This is the Little Hoover Commission hearing on organic waste recycling, part 2, for Thursday, August 25th, 2022. My name is Pedro Nava. I'm chair of the Little Hoover Commission. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's introduce the other commissioners, some of whom are here already and some who I'm sure will be joining us. We have Vice Chair Sharon Byrne, Commissioners Dion Aroner, David Byer, Cynthia Buiza, Anthony Cannella, Bill Emerson, Gil Garcetti, Jana Sidley, and we may be joined by some legislative members. We'll see what happens a little as we move along through the meeting. We also have commission staff, Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster, Project Managers Crystal Beckham and Tristan Stein, Analyst Sherry McAllister, and Ashley Hurley. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping before we turn to the subject at hand. Commissioners, your audio and video will be turned on throughout the duration of the hearing. You may mute yourself if you wish. Please remember to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment or ask a question during the hearing. The video and audio of our hearing witnesses will be turned on when it's their chance to speak. Members of the public will be muted during this hearing. We will have a public comment session at the end. Those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted during that public comment session. If you want to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom as you can see on the screen. by clicking on the hand icon to join our public comment queue. Those who have joined us by phone may send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov, letting us know you want to address the commission. Please provide the phone number from which you have joined so that we know who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails requesting comment through the duration of the hearing. As is customary at our commission hearings, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We're recording today's hearing, and after the hearing, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to the YouTube channel and Facebook page. Now, to the substance of today's hearing. This is the second in a series of commission hearings on organic waste recycling. At our first hearing in Long Beach, we focused, I'm sorry. At our first hearing in Long Beach, we focused on challenges faced by local officials from urban jurisdictions and grassroots organizations in diverting organic waste in accordance with SB 1383. This new law requires that California residents and businesses separate food scraps, yard waste, and other organic materials from the rest of the garbage. We learned about the gap between backyard composting and large-scale industrial operations. Witnesses provided recommendations on how to create more space for neighborhood and community-level composting to fill this gap. During today's hearing, we'll continue to explore the challenges and recommendations for implementing SB 1383. We will hear from a representative from the California Food Bank Association, who will testify about the challenges in implementing the requirement for edible food recovery. Then we will hear from representatives from rural jurisdictions on their perspectives on SB 1383 implementation. And having looked at the background material prepared by Crystal, the rural areas have a set of challenges that I think merit close examination and an in-depth discussion, because they are fairly unique to places that are different from the large-scale cities. Now, in the next month, we're going to hold 2 additional events on organic waste recycling. 2 weeks from today, we'll hold a 3rd hearing in which we'll hear representatives from the state talk to us about organic waste recycling. 2 weeks after that, we're going to hold an industry-focused advisory committee roundtable, which is a little more informal than the hearings that we have, and contribute a great deal to an in-depth understanding of the issues. I want to thank Commissioners Byer and Cannella for serving on the subcommittee for this study and for their leadership on this crucial topic. This hearing was organized by project manager Crystal Beckham, who's wearing a really attractive headset. And so I'd like to ask Crystal if you would please be so kind to introduce the first witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our first witness is Becky Silva. She is the Director of Government Relations for the California Association of Food Banks. Becky, when you are promoted to panelist and when you're ready, please unmute yourself and begin your presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thank you so much to all of you for the invitation to join this meeting and to share our perspective from CAFB. So thank you for having me. And I believe the PowerPoint slide will be coming up in a moment. Okay, here we go. Okay, so next slide, please. So just wanted to start with a little overview of what our organization does. So the California Association of Food Banks is a membership organization made up of 41 member food banks from throughout the state with a shared mission to end hunger in California. We offer several types of programs. We have a staff of about 30 people. We run our state's farm to family program, where we partner with food growers and producers from around the state to make those items available to food banks. We hold one of the state's largest CalFresh outreach, or that's our state's food stamp program outreach program. And we subcontract with about 50 other partners to do direct client level outreach. We also do a lot of state and federal advocacy on issues around hunger and poverty, And we provide lots of member services for our 41 food bank members. Next slide. So our member food banks, 41 of them, are scattered all across California. They serve all counties. So every county in California has an associated food bank. They are big, they are small, they're in rural areas, they're in very urban areas. So they really do represent a pretty diverse set of organizations. And here's a link which you can use to locate your own local food bank as well. So we have a list of them on our website. Next slide. So for those of you that might be new to understanding what food banks do, just wanted to explain briefly kind of the difference between food banks and food pantries, which often get a little bit conflated. So food banks are typically big warehouses. They don't distribute to people directly, typically, and they give food to food pantries. So if you can picture what Costco looks like on the inside, that's typically what food banks look like as well. They're very large operations. Food pantries, on the other hand, are much smaller community-based sites, and they typically offer distributions within their communities to individuals and families on a weekly or monthly basis, depending on that particular food pantry. And they're often located in churches, community centers, YMCAs, schools, things like that. And the 41 food banks that are our members, in turn, partner with over 5,500 pantries across the state. Next slide. So I just wanted to also briefly touch on the impact of COVID-19 on hunger in California. So currently there are 4.9 million people on CalFresh as of June of this year, compared to 3.8 million people in June of 2019. So I just think that that's a really powerful illustration of the depth of food insecurity that our state is facing, especially since the COVID-19 crisis began just 2.5 years ago. Similarly alarming statistic, 40% of kids experienced food insecurity at the height of the stay-at-home order. And food insecurity in California increased from 10% pre-pandemic to nearly 25%, which is just, again, a really staggering number for us to keep in mind. Next slide. It's also really important for us to look at and really recognize and grapple with the huge inequity that exists among our communities when it comes to food insecurity. So especially when you compare food insecurity rates among white communities versus Latinx and Black communities, those communities of color experience food insecurity at double the rate that white communities face. And that's a detail that we really have to keep in mind. I see a hand raised.
Yes, hi. Just a very quick question. On the last slide, that you indicated that there are 4.9 million people who are involved in California Fresh, and yet the number is 10 million for food insecurity. Why is that not? Why are those numbers different?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I really appreciate you raising it. So not all people are eligible for CalFresh. Right? There are income guidelines, there's immigration status requirements, there's all sorts of things that go into eligibility determinations for CalFresh. So I see that not all people are eligible. Not all people apply for it, even if they are eligible, right? It's a program that you have to elect yourself into. So there's lots of people who might be experiencing food insecurity who might choose not to apply. Or who might face difficulty in the application process and just sort of give up. They might, I think we've all experienced having to apply for some sort of program or interact with a government agency in a way that feels so discouraging that we just give up midway through. So certainly people experience that as well.
Do you believe that advertising of the program is sufficient, that those who know about it or those who could be eligible know about it and then they just don't apply? Or could the state do a better job advertising it as well to make sure that more people who are eligible would apply?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, the California Department of Social Services and lots of partner organizations like ourselves, and food banks and other organizations that provide direct client level outreach do a lot of outreach in their communities to make sure that people know about the program, that they're offering assistance if people feel like they can't navigate it just on their own. I think that we probably all agree that there's always more we could do. But there is a lot of the effort being put into making sure that people are aware of and are being assisted in the process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for answering my questions.
Yeah, thank you for the questions.
And
Um,
Mr. Chairman, I see Commissioner Byer has raised his
Yeah,
hand.
I see, Commissioner Byer.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Jana. Those were great questions. I'm a big fan of food banks, at least personally. My wife and I are very focused on this is an extremely efficient way to deliver something vitally important to the community. So don't misconstrue my question. Is the disposal of organic waste a distraction from your main mission? Because I think even if you perfectly executed the organic waste disposal plans and you had the money to do it, it's not fundamental to your mission. So what I'm trying to get at is how to streamline the obligations you may have under this law so that they're manageable and that you can keep your eye on the ball of what you are primarily set up to do.
Yeah, certainly. That is a really big and important question that I could probably try to answer over many hours if I was given that opportunity, but I'll try to give a short answer. So yes, I think what you're getting at is, in terms of addressing the root causes of hunger and the big picture public policy solutions, is SB 1383 kind of a distraction from that? So I would say, our mission is to end hunger, and that means sort of grappling with the issue of poverty, systemic racism, big systemic issues where food insecurity, frankly, is a symptom of those issues. And so I think that we would say that it requires all of the strategies. We have to be addressing issues with CalFresh, like we talked about a moment ago. We have to be looking at what is causing poverty in the first place. But I also think that when these kinds of opportunities like SB 1383 arise, even though they might be kind of seen as small compared to the big picture solutions, I think we have to do our best to try and make the best possible outcome out of those opportunities as they arise as well. So I'll go into a little bit more detail in my following slides about SB 1383 and the interaction with food banks, but really appreciate your point and your question.
Yeah, you were breaking up quite a bit there, but I think I got the gist of what you were getting at. I guess my follow-up question is, what's the most efficient way to utilize the nudge of organic waste disposal? That is, people giving you things so that you can address your fundamental mission on attacking hunger in a way that doesn't end up eating into your mission by unnecessary bureaucratic means or insufficient funds in order to be able to implement the law. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. The phrase I would use is, what's the parsimony of regulation? What's the least regulation that you could accept, incentives, disincentives, or rules that would permit you to do what you want to do, but to do it with the least amount of interference or stupid stuff, as former President Obama calls it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. And I would definitely say that one of the biggest constraints that we've been hearing from food banks pretty much across the board is that, yes, 1383 is an opportunity to recover more food, and that's always a good thing in terms of food banks being able to distribute more food to their communities. There are huge constraints when it comes to capacity. So, food banks are nonprofit organizations. that typically do a lot of fundraising in order to keep their operations running. You can think of, what it takes to run an operation like a food bank is including running a warehouse, having trucks to distribute the food, having all the equipment in the warehouse, having staff to operate the food bank. It just is a really resource intensive job. And so when we look at SB 1383 and the opportunity that exists there to recover more food, I think the biggest thing that food banks would say is we need resources. We need funding in order to be able to move more food.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the questions.
So as we're on this, I have a follow-up question. You're talking about resources to move more food. I'm really curious of your view of the need for food, not the need for food to be moved, but the underlying need for the more food. I am assuming there is quite a need, but I'd really like your insight into that, just to understand, then to go turn around if the need's 50% more, 100% more, how much, then we can sort of correlate how much funding would be necessary to move that volume of food.
Sure, absolutely. And actually, the next couple of slides in the PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared, I think we'll start to get at your question. So I'm just waiting for a moment for the slides to come back. The next slide. Yep, perfect. Okay, so I think to your question, so we recently did a survey of our member food banks back in May, so just a couple of months ago, and we found that California's food banks are serving more than 1.5 times the number of people that they were serving pre-pandemic. So that is just absolutely massive in terms of food banks distributing more food. 1.5 times more people than pre-pandemic. And also just to highlight that is a number that food banks are sustaining. That wasn't just a blip on the radar that lasted for a couple of months. That's what food banks are doing still today after 2.5 years since the COVID-19 crisis began. So we don't expect these numbers to change dramatically anytime soon. Next slide. And another way that we've been kind of tracking how food banks are doing in their elevated needs is the impact of the inflation crisis in terms of the cost of food. So of course we feel that as a strain as individuals at the grocery store, but food banks also purchase food. And so we have found through that survey that California food banks spent 3 times more money on purchasing food in the last year than they did pre-pandemic. So I think that points to, serving more people in terms of, distributing more pounds of food, as well as the cost of the food going up. And so both of those factors together have meant that food banks are really blowing through their annual food spending budgets. Next slide. So I just have a couple of quotes here, which I think really kind of illustrate this point. So from the Sacramento Food Bank and Family Services, from an LA Times article back in April, they said people are on that razor's edge right now, and the cost of gas is eating into their food budgets. The food bank also highlighted that the price they're paying per dozen of eggs has more than doubled in recent months, from 93 cents per dozen to $2.20 per dozen. And they've seen a 40% increase in people served in the last month. From the Alameda County Community Food Bank, they said their grocery money isn't going as far as it used to. Gas prices are high. Many people who come here either depend on us or use it to supplement their meals. And so they also shared that particular Wednesday ended up being the distribution site's busiest in a 1.5 years. And it was also the day the food bank distributed eggs, a really popular item. So that food bank now estimates that 1 in 4 people in their county are experiencing food insecurity, compared to 1 in 5 pre-pandemic. Next slide. Great. So in terms of opportunities with SB 1383, I think, we would all say that food banks are always in need of food. That is the work that we're engaged with, is looking for food that can be distributed back out to the communities that need them. And so SB 1383 really is an opportunity to strengthen and form new partnerships to increase food donations. Next slide. So we've really, I'll stop for a moment. I think I see a hand raised.
Yes, Commissioner Garcetti, you're muted. I'm sorry, Gil, you're muted. Gil?
Commissioner Garcetti, I believe
There
you're
you
muted on your end. There we
I
are.
got it. I got
Thank
it.
you.
Sorry, my fault. Becky, excuse me. You used the term food insecurity. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. It means that you don't know where your next meal is going to come from. So it means that you carry with you a weight and uncertainty around how you're going to get food for your family. So at the end of the day, that might mean that you were able to meet, eat 3 meals, but maybe you had to forego paying your phone bill that month, or maybe you were able to provide food for your children, but not for yourself that day. So food insecurity is the term that we use for people who really are not sure and are on the razor's edge in terms of how they're going to feed themselves and their families.
Okay, I understand that, but how do you determine it then? I mean, are you asking people, do they, every time they come, they have to check off a question, an answer to the question?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there are several ways that academic researchers try to measure that. And a lot of it has to do with looking at poverty rates, because we know that poverty rates are really closely tied with people's experiences with food insecurity. And then in terms of looking at, food banks and who visits them, I think food bankers would all agree that visiting a food bank is kind of a difficult thing to swallow and to do for a lot of people. And so if a person is showing up at a food pantry to seek food, they are food insecure. And so they might not be directly asking them, but I think it's a really safe assumption to be made that a person visiting a food pantry is food insecure.
Thank you, Becky.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Before you start, Commissioner Buiza has her hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and apologies that I have to stay off camera because my internet is down and I'm using my hotspot. Becky, thank you so much for the testimony. Just in relation to the question from Commissioner Garcetti, this has to do about the racial makeup of the food insecure population. Do you have data on where some of the most distinguishable communities are coming from the food insecure population?
Yeah, so I shared one slide earlier in my presentation that looks at food insecurity rates among Latinx, Black households, Asian households, and white households. And we really do see a huge difference in terms of food insecurity rates among those. So for example, within the Latinx community, food insecurity is over 27% of the community. That's almost 1 in 3 people. Whereas for white communities, it's more like 14%. So, those disparities are tremendous. And it means that we have to really try to grapple with that and make sure that we're meeting communities that are in need of the support the most.
Okay, so, and sorry if I missed that slide. I was also just curious about the what drives from this particular breakdown. Are they driven by of course, like socioeconomic status, the regions where they're coming from, as pointed out in some of the background document?
Yeah, absolutely. So, food insecurity, like I said a moment ago, is really closely tied to poverty in general. Hunger is a symptom of poverty. And so when we look at poverty rates across California, these disparities also hold. Communities of color face disproportionate barriers in terms of seeking employment, in terms of seeking housing, educational attainment. There are lots of barriers that communities of color face in securing a stable income for themselves and their families. And so I think that is the driver of what we see in the food insecurity rates.
Thank you.
Okay, so back to the slides. We have been really encouraging local jurisdictions as they were doing capacity planning earlier this year to reach out to their local food banks, to engage them in the capacity planning process, and to help think about funding streams that might help to support the work of food banks. So just to keep in mind that some counties have multiple food banks located within them, which makes capacity planning a little bit more complicated. And also to know, the sort of opposite of that is true in that some food banks may be working with multiple jurisdictions as well. So the overlap of jurisdictions and the areas that food banks cover are a little bit messy and not always cut and dry. Next slide. So in terms of just implications in general for SB 1383 implementation, I just think it's very important for us to remember that this has been a really difficult couple of years for food banks. I talked about the rising demand at food banks and the populations that they're serving, but food banks need ongoing resources in order to coordinate, store, and distribute more food. Many food banks at the beginning of the pandemic had to kind of completely redesign their operational models. It's a couple of years ago now, but you might remember that at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, basically all volunteer operations were shut down because there were fears that there would be the spread of the virus. And it was discouraged for people to congregate, which meant that food banks and food pantries had to really redesign and reimagine the way that they designed their programs. And so just to remember that in light of SB 1383 implementation, food banks are still kind of in the midst of this crisis that they've been grappling with for the last couple of years. Next slide. So I have 3 slides where I just give a few examples of what food banks have been saying. So from Feeding San Diego, they said capacity constraints at the point of delivery limit how much we can get into distribution. Working to increase capacity in storage, refrigeration, food rescue vehicles, and people to remove constraints. Food quantity is not the issue, it's the logistics of getting the food into the end points of the distribution locations. Next slide. So this one is from the second harvest of Silicon Valley. They said, we're excited about the opportunity to get even more variety into the hands of our community, but it does require a lot of coordination and logistics and funding. Next slide. Food Bank of Contra, Costa, and Solano. They said her organization was concerned with the uncertainty of future food volume and more food quality challenges. She said, it's our job to look for more food, but we have to ensure we don't become a dumping ground. And I also just wanted to give this example about food bank capacity needs. So in the fall of last year, we surveyed all of our member food banks to assess their needs coming out of the COVID-19 crisis. As we've talked about, the pandemic has put an enormous strain on the emergency food infrastructure, and it's revealed really significant capacity constraints. So the statewide need for one-time improvements to food banks and their local agencies, from things like warehouse expansion to refrigerated trucks, is approximately $653 million. So that is just a huge number, and it represents the needs across our network in terms of warehouse needs, refrigerated trucks, pallet jacks, all the equipment and infrastructure that's needed to accept food donations, to store that food, and then to redistribute out into their communities. Next slide. And this is my final slide. So the 2022-23 state budget that was just passed actually includes $180 million for organic waste infrastructure. And we at CAFB really believe that we need more specific language that both the state and local governments know that they can partner with local food banks to implement this strategy. So we've been working with the Senate to add clarification around these dollars, that they could use these dollars to support the work of food banks. And so we believe that putting in trailer bill or budget bill that these funds can be used to partner with food banks in terms of staffing, infrastructure is critical to getting food banks and local and state governments together at the same table to implement SB 1383.
Yeah, I see Commissioner Byer has his hand raised.
Great.
Commissioner Byer, you are muted, I believe, on your end.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to hypothesize that not all counties and not all food banks are the same. And that in some counties, you're going to get more donations than others. So if that's true, it seems like a per capita or per food bank or some kind of formula where everybody gets the same thing may not make sense. Is it possible to have an easy to implement set of rules for the state to distribute money for infrastructure? For example, if you increase the amount of donations you get by more than 50%, then you get a special bump up in allocation of infrastructure dollars. What I'm trying to get at is some places are going to end up with not a big bolus of donated food, and having them have a warehouse or forklifts doesn't make sense. And Alameda, I can almost guarantee, is going to do very, very well. So how do you do that as a trade association where all your members want to be treated the same?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And certainly, and I should also mention, if I haven't yet, that food banks are not required to participate in SB 1383 implementation. It is totally up to food bank by food bank what their capacity is in terms of engaging with implementation locally with their jurisdictions. And we are actually in the process of doing another survey for food bank members to assess more around SB 1383 implementation and what are the resources that you need and if we can quantify that. So I'm sorry that I don't have a neat and tidy answer for you, but just to recognize that, that yes, it is tricky in terms of thinking about what the right sort of method or mechanism would be for making funding available to food banks. And I would also say that, you know, some food banks might not be engaging with implementation locally just because they currently don't have the capacity. So it wouldn't make sense to base, you know, their sort of additional funding on whether or not they're engaging, because just not having funding at all is the barrier in and of itself to participating. So hopefully that helps a little bit, but I appreciate your question.
Yeah, Commissioner Cannella also has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for that presentation. It was great. Food banks, food pantries do a great job, certainly in the Central Valley, and I appreciate it. But, you know, the goal today is to talk about edible food recovery, right? So it's from food they call food waste generators, grocery stores, large restaurants, hotels. The goal is to not throw that food away, but somehow have it recovered to eat, which seems very difficult to me, because if a hotel or a grocery store or a restaurant is going to get rid of food, that means they didn't sell it, right? And then the staff report, I thought the staff did a good job talking about people don't want to eat other people's trash, which I think is right on the money. So if we had a lot of money, how could you possibly divert, using a food bank or a food pantry, how could you divert food that is at the last part of its life cycle to shift it to feed people? Is that even possible?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, you know, many food banks across our network already have strong partnerships with places like grocery stores, or if you think of, like, for example, in San Francisco, there's the big produce market,
yeah,
which sells wholesale produce. You know, companies like Cisco that deal with huge quantities of food. So a lot of food banks already have relationships with those types of businesses. And food banks have become, you know, real experts in figuring out what the right mechanisms and systems and procedures are for recovering that food. So I would say that in general, food banks are really well positioned in terms of their expertise, the infrastructure that they already have, the relationships that they already have. It's just a matter of thinking about, if we're asking them to scale up and do more, then they have to be met with the appropriate resources to be able to do that. And so hopefully that answers your question a little bit, but I would say that food banks in general, this is their, excuse the food pun, but this is their bread and butter. This is what they do every day. And so what they really need is more capacity and funding to be able to do even more of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see that we've been joined by Senator Nielsen. Senator, do you have any questions or comments? This might
No,
be
apologize. We just adjourned, so I got back on as quick as I could. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Understood. Thank you very much. Let me take a quick survey of our commissioners to see if they have any other questions or comments. Not seeing any further hands being raised. Ms. Silva, I want to thank you very much for your testimony. This is an important part of as Senator Cannell identified, the food recovery and some of the complicated issues having to do with that. But again, thank you for helping us with our hearing.
Thank you so much for having me. And I would also just pose, if there's any interest at a future hearing in having actual food bank members come and share their experience with 1383 directly, I'd be happy to help identify some food banks and coordinate that. So just wanted to put that idea out there. And thank you again for having me on today.
Thank you very much. Crystal.
Thank you, Ms. Silva, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next panel comprises Staci Heaton, who's the Deputy Executive Director for the Rural Counties Environmental Joint Powers Authority, and also a Senior Policy Advocate for the Rural County Representatives of California, and Jared Carter, who is the Deputy Public Works Director for the County of Madera. Welcome, Staci and Jared. And Staci, when you're ready, go ahead and begin your presentation.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, Chair and members of the Commission. We really appreciate the invitation to come talk about this very important topic today. This has been consuming a lot of our time recently, so I appreciate the invitation. So I just want to begin with a little overview of who we are and what we do. And we'll start, and you see kind of a map of who we are, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. I'll put these on so I can actually see what I'm doing. So the Rural County Representatives of California, or RCRC, provides advocacy and economic development support to 39 rural California counties statewide. And the RCRC member counties are the ones that are in both the dark blue and the sort of lighter blue on your map. That's our 39 member RCRC counties. Our board of directors is comprised of one elected county supervisor from each member county, and our members generally share many common challenges and goals unique to rural California communities, such as wildfire mitigation and forest resilience, the need for broader deployment of broadband and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and an overarching struggle to create new economic opportunities for their residents, given the state's often urban-centric political climate. Now, the Rural Counties Environmental Joint Powers Authority, or ESJPA, as we shorten it down to, are the counties that you see in the darker blue, and there's 26 of them, and they are members of both RCRC and ESJPA. And we specialize in solid waste and recycling advocacy, technical support for our members, and grant assistance for those 26 RCRC member jurisdictions that choose to be members. Membership in ESJPA is voluntary and for RCRC member counties, and a county has to be a member of RCRC to join ESJPA and get the benefits that we offer. Our advocacy efforts overall benefit our full RCRC membership. So what we do benefits all 39 members. But as Deputy Executive Director of ESJPA, much of my current focus, as well as our whole ESJPA team, centers on assisting our ESJPA member jurisdictions with implementation of and compliance with the SB 1383 organics regulations. And that's going to be the focus of our testimony today. So what's the difference between rural and urban or suburban when we're talking about implementing these regulations, or just the demographics and the differences in the two? a lot of people ask that and ask us what's so challenging for rural solid waste jurisdictions versus urban and suburban communities. And it really boils down to the combination of landscape and population. ESJPA's 26 member counties contain roughly 38% of the state's total land mass. However, those counties also account for 64% of California's total National Forest System lands. That's fewer than half of the state's counties, with almost 2/3 of the state's National Forest lands. A few of our member counties are almost completely managed by federal land managers, which is a challenge. For example, Inyo County has more than 90% National Forest and Bureau of Land Management combined. And Alpine County contains around 96% federally managed land. There are lands that include mountainous terrain, forest, deserts, and additional challenges in winter months during years when we actually are still lucky enough to get significant snowpack. This past winter was not one of those, but sometimes it does still happen. In comparison, our counties are the most sparsely populated. Most recent census numbers indicate that ESJPA counties account for only around 2.8% of California's total population. In summary, the solid waste jurisdictions in ESJPA's 26 counties cover 38% of California's land, but serve only 2.8% of its residents over a whole lot of open space and challenging terrain. These characteristics also influence how our residents handle their waste, and that's unique in a few ways, and I'm going to talk about that. So a lot of our residents self-haul their solid waste. It's pretty common. Rural communities often have many small transfer stations where residents take their own waste and don't get curbside pickup. Green waste, which is included in organic waste, is skewed more toward cleared brush in a lot of our areas to comply with state defensible space requirements and to mitigate for wildfire impacts, which is something we definitely encourage in those wild and urban interface areas. It's often more common than your grass clippings or shrub clippings that you might see in a more urbanized area. Franchises are limited to more densely populated areas, so it makes it a little limiting to have options for collection in unincorporated areas. And the number of organics facilities is very limited in a lot of our rural communities. So with those sparse populations, many areas are without local infrastructure to actually take organic waste. So let's pause for a minute and talk about what organics actually are. And that's an important question. What does the law say organics are? A lot of people think of organic waste recycling as simply composting food waste or ensuring edible food is utilized rather than put in a landfill. But the definition of organic waste spans actually a few different regulations. The first one being Assembly Bill 901, which was passed in 2015, and that was a recycling and disposal facility reporting requirement. So several different types of facilities are required to actually report on their waste. Assembly Bill 1826, which was in 2014 mandatory commercial organics recycling. So commercial facilities have been required to do mandatory organics recycling for a while. And then, of course, Senate Bill 1383, which is the short-lived climate pollutant bill that was passed in 2016. So there's a chart before you, and that chart kind of shows the differences in the three on how they define what organics means. And there's a few little differences and a little nuanced differences in between the three. Probably AB 901 and SB 1383 are the two that most closely track, but you'll see when we're talking about SB 1383, it means food, it means green material. So that's your shrub clippings and your grass clippings and that type of thing. It means landscape and pruning waste, lumber and wood. So any kind of waste from, buildings or defensible space, brush clearing, that kind of thing is going to be included. Paper products and printing and writing paper, because where does paper come from? Originally, it comes from trees, so it's organic material. Manure. That's a fun one, because when we talk about rural communities, rural communities have ranches and farms and farm animals and horses and things like that. So manure is a big deal in our communities. Also, that applies to small animals, and I'll get to that in a minute. Biosolids, digestate and sludges, and organic textiles and carpets. So yes, things like wool and cotton textiles also are considered organic materials. So under SB 1383. So if we wanted to get even further down into semantics, we could try to parse out these definitions at a more granular level. For example, is chewing gum considered food? And the answer to that is yes. Are your little dog's leavings that you scoop up out on the sidewalk when you take her for a walk considered manure? The answer to that is yes. Buy compostable doggy bags, please. Ultimately, solid waste jurisdictions now have the responsibility to make sure that all of their residents and commercial businesses comply with the provisions of the various organics laws in statute. So now I want to move on to what is the rural responsibility for organic waste recycling and talk about the differences between that and what we see in urban and suburban communities. So CalRecycle estimates that California disposes of approximately 30 million tons of organic waste each year. And in 2020, ESJPA's 26 member counties disposed of just over 1.7 million tons, or around 5% of California's total organic waste stream. Because of their unique characteristics and the relatively small contributions to organic waste, rural jurisdictions may be able to delay or be exempt from some of the requirements of the organics regulations. Because of our commitment to making organics recycling work, and we did support SB 1383 when it was in the legislature, so we are committed to making this program work. We worked really hard with CalRecycle when they were developing the regulations, and we agreed on some on some limited exemptions, and they are in the mandatory commercial organics recycling or more. There is a rural exemption, so counties with populations of less than 70,000 don't have to provide organics collection until January 1st, 2027. SB 1383 has a similar provision that we worked with CalRecycle on. Counties with population of 70,000 or less don't have to provide organics collection until January 1st, 2027. Those counties still need to meet procurement requirements for recycled content, for paper, and for edible food diversion. So those requirements are still there for those counties. SB 1383 also has a what they call a low population waiver. So counties that qualify for that waiver, it goes by census tract. So unincorporated census tracts with population density of less than 50 people per square mile qualify for the low population waiver. Cities and special districts have their own low population waiver qualifications, which means that that jurisdiction disposed of less than 5,000 tons of solid waste in 2014. As reported in the reporting system, and has a total population of less than 7,500 people. There's one more waiver, which is a unique and kind of important waiver when you're talking about organics, and that is the SB 1383 Elevation Waiver, or what we lovingly refer to as the BEAR waiver. So this is limited to census tracts above or equal to 4,500 feet in elevation, because of exactly what it sounds like, bears. When you bring wild animals into the equation and you're putting organic waste outside your home, you're going to draw specifically bears to your home. And that is a public safety concern. So it exempts those areas from collection of food waste and food soiled paper, and it allows residents to maintain wildlife safe waste receptacles that mask the smell and the contents from bears in particular. So the unique challenges of, oh, I see a hand.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
Commissioner Byer. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the detail. Not sure I understand all the initials, but I guess my question really goes to the bigger one, which is, given the relative population of the counties you're talking about and the amount of organic waste that is disposed of and could be disposed of. Is it advisable for us to consider a broader or deeper exemption for what I'll call truly rural areas to avoid the micromanagement you just described? In other words, this is really, really complicated. The waiver process sounds like Byzantine approval system, which has got to undermine public confidence in the viability of organic waste generally. And so what I'm wondering about is there, given that you supported the law and you negotiated solutions to the regulation, is there a simpler way to deal with this? Doubling the size of the things that are exempt, or changing the county threshold from 70,000 to 100,000, which my math says you'd end up with only 36 counties being covered instead of 58 or whatever. So my point is there a simpler way to deal with this that takes on board the complexity you've just described? Because it seems like it's going to get in the way if the state bureaucracy in charge of this law has to follow up with really infinitesimally small amounts of organic waste at issue.
I will say that we attempted to negotiate some broader waivers into this program during the regulation development process. This was the most agreeable that we could come up with at the time. We are still talking to CalRecycle about a broader waiver or perhaps a permanent rural exemption to this program. So those talks are not dead. We're still actively talking to CalRecycle, but we did make an attempt at some broader exemptions, and that wasn't exactly fruitful during the regulation process.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Pedro. I think Commissioner Byer makes a really important and valid point. I emailed Crystal and said, I love the bear because I think that really does point out a failure to comprehend the dynamics of a rural county as compared to an urban situation. And part of what I think Commissioner Byer is getting at is, when you have a regulatory system that that fails to appropriately take into account the distinctions between areas, it leads to a lack of confidence. And I'm guessing, Ms. Heaton, that you were involved when you were involved in trying to come up with exemptions. It was a self-defense measure to ensure that there weren't more draconian requirements imposed that, practically speaking, would not have been able to be implemented, leading to the apprehension of the imposition of fines and penalties. And so, you sort of showed up to the party hoping to get a little bit of something, and you had to take the best that you could get, given what you were confronted with. But there was an aspect in reading the staff report about how unworkable so much of being asked of rural counties, it's not feasible, and works at cross purposes. When you think about the expense associated with trying to recover what is, relatively speaking, a minuscule amount of organics, given the kind of definition, even as broad as it is, the small volume of so-called organics, how hard that is going to be on the ground for people to actually satisfy. So I think that what I would be interested in hearing from you is, and sometimes Commissioner Byer does this, if you had your magic wand and you could wave it, in a way that wouldn't lead to your immediate termination, what it is that you would ask for with respect to our recommendations. Let's just say you're talking to us about Little Hoover Commission's examination of this legislation and what it means to people in rural counties. So if you were able to craft a recommendation, what would you suggest we look at as part of our report?
Well, I think there's probably three things that we would recommend. First of all, a pause, because right now there are several things that are making this very difficult for our jurisdictions to implement. The first thing being that a lot of things keep moving and changing, and we can't find agreement on certain things. The one big issue that's standing out right now is the self-haul issue. We believe that the regulations allow for residents to haul their own waste. There are a lot of our residents that live down dirt roads, down gravel roads, in areas where you really can't get a garbage truck to do curbside collection. And Cal Recycle doesn't exactly agree with us on that.
Well, you don't have curbs.
Well, that's exactly right.
You can't have curbside collection if there are no curbs.
And so we're trying to work with Cal Recycle on this, but we still have not been able, and we've been working with them on this for several months, but we still cannot reach an agreement on, whether or not allowing self-haul is permissible and what happens to one of our jurisdictions if they do allow their residents to self-haul. So that's been a big point of contention for several months now that we are having trouble getting an agreement on. Another issue that's recently cropped up is because there's no good faith effort provision in SB 1383. Now we're sort of retroactively seeing the good faith efforts provisions being removed from the mandatory commercial organics recycling compliance for some of our jurisdictions. And so they're being told that they need to require or reach 100% compliance, or else they're going to go to a compliance planning process. And that's not in the regulations. And so we're trying to figure out, well, why are, so I think we need to, we'd ask for a pause so we can work out some of these outstanding issues. And then to make the rural exemption permanent for those small counties that are, 70,000 right now population or below. And then to recognize good faith effort, which is not currently recognized in SB 1383. 100% compliance from all of your residents and all of your businesses is a unicorn. It's just not something that jurisdictions are going to be able, with the resources and the funding that they have, it's not something that is really going to be feasible, particularly in a lot of the small rural jurisdictions. So I think a recognition of good faith effort would go a long way in helping our jurisdictions to strive for compliance with this program.
Right. Thank you. Do you have more slides for us?
There was only one more slide as it related to one of the waivers, but
well, we should see that.
Okay, so let's go ahead and put that up there. So the one more slide I had to do with the waivers and how the waivers probably need more refinement to capture more communities. So this is the Nevada County Census Tract. So you'll see that in rural county census tracts, as they relate to the low population waiver, can often include really large unserviceable areas that are lumped together with more densely populated communities. And here is a Nevada County map. This is Census Tract 701. This census tract is around 20 miles long, and it has limited vehicle access for curbside collection like we just talked about. And we proposed breaking census tracts down into smaller block groups. This was one of the things that we proposed to account for areas like this. And we still think that something like that would be an appropriate way to grant waivers for those areas with low population density. And we also proposed, tweaking the bear waiver to go lower elevation, because bears don't stop at 4,500 foot elevation. They can get all the way down to 3,000 or even lower. And once you draw a bear, it becomes a nuisance animal. It's a public safety risk. It's a risk to the bear. And so those were just a few of the tweaks that we did ask for with some of the waivers that we weren't able to obtain. So I think with the conversation that we just had, we covered a lot of my testimony just in that conversation we just had. So,
Well, I also think
our recommendations.
Well, thank you very much. But I also think with respect to the issues with the bear and other wildlife, one of the realities that we're embracing is climate change.
Yeah.
And don't tell me that there isn't going to be some modification of whatever we identify as a range for bears that isn't going to change.
Yeah.
Over time. I mean, we've had testimony about what's going on with wineries with climate change and how they're going to have to move from place to place, and how habitats are changing. So I think the notion of 4,500 feet for something is probably supported by some analysis, but I have to believe that there's a certain measure of ambiguity connected with that as well. And I see Commissioner Nielsen has his hand up.
Yeah, let me pipe here a little bit with the RCRC. And I go way back with you. Jim Branham worked for me for many, many years. So
Yes,
I know all about your organization. You do a fine job.
Appreciate that.
But in this general issue, one of the frustrating issues, but a critical one because of the fires and the decades of accumulation of fuel, is forest and wildland management. And I've been working for a whole career to get money in the budget. Now we're finally getting a little bit. It's been erratic and not well placed, but it's getting better. Can't some of that resource be applied to what we're dealing with here now? It's forest and wildland management, but it does require cleaning up and whatever. So Staci, would that have any application to some of what you're doing here?
Yes, sir, it would. And I appreciate that question. Woody biomass can be used to meet the procurement requirements for organic waste products. I think the barrier there, and each jurisdiction has a certain procurement requirement they have to meet every year by tons for organic, byproducts. But I think the barrier here is that the targets are really big for a lot of the counties, and in our counties, the infrastructure is just not there yet in the near term to take those woody biomass products out of the forest. And at RCRC, we're working on a project to deal with that as well. But we need that infrastructure in place to help get the materials out of the forest as much as we need anything else. Now, there is a requirement in SB 1383 that some of this material be procured to use for biofuels, to use for vehicles. But another barrier we're coming up against is that in a lot of the current zero emission vehicle regulations that are being developed at the Air Resources Board, they really don't have a path for that to use these materials. So they're kind of at cross purposes at the moment. And so, we're trying to reconcile all of this right now.
Staci, could we engage to a higher level of support the Resources Agency to be helpful here?
Yeah, and we get a lot of support from the Resources Agency. We really do. Secretary Crowfoot and his team over there have been very helpful and very supportive.
Okay, well, give some thought. Maybe we could have a meeting and I'd be a part of that with you. I work with him on a number of different projects.
That'd be great.
I'd like to try to marry some of what we're trying to do in fire prevention, if you will, and some of what we're trying to accomplish here in these counties. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Heaton. I think we got another witness, Jared Carter from Madera County, and I've got a feeling that some of what he's going to bring to us is very similar to what we've heard from Ms. Heaton. And I should let you know, I spent a fair amount of my life in Fresno County, and I'm grateful for that experience because it really did help form my familiarity with the differences that you see in an urban county as compared to a place like Fresno and a place like Madera. So, Mr. Carter, I guess no. Crystal, do you want to do an introduction? But go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, actually, before we do that, I did notice that Commissioner Eriner has raised her hand.
My apologies, Commissioner Eriner. Please go ahead. Thanks, Ethan.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting and kind of all new to me. But Staci, how do the tribes fit into all of this? Because I'm presuming in lots of these small counties, right, we still have reservations and tribes. Are they exempt from all of this, or do they participate? So tell us how that works out.
Yeah, as far as I know, the tribes are part of the waste jurisdictions of their counties, so they're not exempt in any way.
There's no distinct. Okay.
No, and one more thing I wanted to point out before we go to Jared real quick. We'd also like to see an emergency waiver for areas that are subject to public safety power shutoffs, because there's a lot of spoiled food during those, and we have suggested an emergency waiver during those time periods because that really ups the amount of organic waste we see in our facilities.
Yeah.
High wildfire areas are really hit hard by that.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, Crystal, I probably jumped in there, but I think you're up.
Yeah, so our next speaker is Jared Carter, who's the Deputy Public Works Director for Madera County. Jared, when you're ready, please unmute yourself and begin your presentation.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you. As Crystal mentioned, I'm with Madera County, and we are just north of Fresno County, Chairman Navas, so we're neighbors. And in terms of I appreciate your comments, Chairman, at the opening about the uniqueness of rural counties, because that is absolutely the case when it comes to counties, and not just their uniqueness from urban and cities, but also individually unique from each other in terms of, the landscapes of many of the things that Staci talked about. Certainly appreciate RCRC and all they've done in helping with rural counties throughout this process. As you've heard, there's been a lot of work on their part. Madera County, in terms of Madera County, we're a little over 2,000 square miles in size, and we range in geography quite significantly. We have our valley areas, which are agricultural, very spread out. Lots of land dedicated to agricultural operations, and to the eastern area of our county is up into the mountains and the foothills. And then, as Staci mentioned, we actually have a lot of national forest that takes up part of our county, including Yosemite National Park, and even onto the other side of the Sierras in the Mammoth area. So very diverse. Our overall population is about 156,000. When you remove the two cities in Madera County, which is Chowchilla and City of Madera, the unincorporated population is about 71, almost 72,000. And the reason I point that out is because you heard earlier that the rural exemptions for 1383 are set at 70,000 population as a county overall. So when we're looked at as a potentially rural exempt county, it accounts for the 156,000 total population of the county. So that's something that is kind of a challenge, because we're right there on that number. And if it was an unincorporated stat or requirement, we're really close. We as a county do not have mandatory collection service. That is something that is, again, unique for, I think, a lot of rural counties, is we do not require folks to have service. As Staci mentioned, many of our residents self-haul, or they, manage their green waste and organic waste in other ways, because they are in rural areas. I could tell you, I grew up in eastern Madera County in the small town of Oakhurst, and I remember as a kid making the trips to the dump, taking our trash to the dump. We did not have trash cans. A trash could not get down our driveway, even if it tried. So those are definitely some unique challenges to rural areas. Staci mentioned that there's been a lot of discussion with cow recycle, and I think one of the challenges that our county and many others have faced is really trying to get the clear understanding and interpretation of these regulations, and specifically when it comes to mandatory collection. That's a topic that's been discussed quite some time. I think Staci mentioned that, getting the clarity on that. We've asked, I know many counties have asked Cal Recycle to provide in writing where they have determined that the mandatory collection is something that applies to 1383. And I don't know that that's ever been provided. I know that there's some question and answer stuff on their website that talks about the term automatic enrollment, which they acknowledge does not exist in the regulations. But the words that they use are provide, and somehow that provide, I guess, is interpreted to them as mandate and, requiring service. I looked up the definition of provide. That's not what it says to me, but at any rate, so there's been a lot of challenges trying to get clarity on some of these things and make sure that we're understanding these things and implementing correctly, right? And when you look at the timing of things, it's very challenging as well. I mean, the regulations were adopted in late 2020, basically COVID era. They came out late 2020, and by 2022, agencies are supposed to have this in place. So that's a very short time frame. I mean, I know that's roughly a year, but in the scheme of things, it's not very much time. And like I said, regulations being released in November and then having to fully understand and comprehend everything that's involved with that, and then start putting that in place. 1 year is definitely a very short time frame. And I know that there was some legislation that was passed subsequent to that in 619 to allow a little bit more time. But at any rate, it is a short time span. And again, everybody's dealing with this in various ways. For us, we don't have any organics facilities in our county, so we have to figure out where our haulers would take those materials. As I mentioned, we don't have mandatory service, so not only do we have to figure out how to implement mandatory service in those areas that are subject to the requirements based on those census numbers, but we also have to add a third cart, because even in our subscription services, we don't have organics as a part of the subscription. So we're mandating service, we're adding service. Our haulers are looking at, more trucks, more carts. All these costs are building up to make this happen. And all that's going to get buried down onto the ratepayers, the residents, because as you probably know, this is an unfunded mandate. So there are no funds coming from anywhere to help offset these costs, for the counties. In fact, I think the legislation specifically says that the counties have to figure out a way to fund this, and for us that translates into rates to the residents.
Yeah, Jared, this is Pedro. Let me ask you, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
no problem.
We consider that to be an act of courtcy on this commission when we interrupt witnesses.
No problem.
But have you done a projection? And maybe you're not even able to get that far because you're not quite sure what you're being asked to do, but have you ever prepared projections on what kind of rate you would have to impose on your individual ratepayers?
Yep.
In order to, okay, good. So what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question because I was just starting to get to that. So you're one step ahead of me, but that's okay. So Madera County actually went through the process and started the process in early 2021. Once we had a little bit of clarity from Cal Recycle, we started the process of the Prop 218 election to implement mandatory collection in those census tracts that were subject to 1383. So with that, we had to work with our haulers to develop rates for this service. And, they vary based on location, right? In the mountain areas, we were seeing about almost a 90% increase. So, and when I say 90% increase, that's a 90% increase for the people who would be paying, adding that organic service to their service that they already had for 2 carts. So their service was going to go from about $36 a month for 2 cart service to around $70 a month. Now, in the valley area, because there's, again, diversity in the geography and, location, it wasn't quite as extreme. It was anywhere from 60 to 65% increase to the rates. But again, all of this is really factored on what it's going to take to actually, provide that service, that additional service. And again, it's the trucks, it's the carts, it's the staff, everything that, our haulers would have to bring in. So those are the figures that we had from our haulers that we took forward with a Prop 218 that we started early in 2021. As you can imagine, residents were not all that excited about that. When we got Prop 218 notices sent out, I think we sent out about 12,000 of them. And we had a lot of phone calls, a lot of people confused, didn't understand. We did hold some public workshops virtually at the time to try and help people, educate them on what 1383 was, what we were being, what the county was basically being mandated to put in place and why. And we did have some Cal Recycle folks who were in attendance on some of those workshops and had an opportunity to hear some of the comments from our residents and folks about, what this looks like and how they see this. I can tell you from a county's perspective, we're the punching bag when this comes to this stuff. We, we get all the hits, and we took a lot, but I think it was very good for some of the Cal Recycle folks, at least, to be on those calls to hear some of those things. Things like self-haul, things like composting, folks saying that, they just don't have organics, or they have, chickens and cows or whatever, it was really, I think, somewhat of an eye opener to some of them to see that, this one size fits all regulation doesn't necessarily work that way. And so, we had a lot of outreach, a lot of comments, a lot of questions. And when we came time for the actual hearing for the Prop 218, which was June 1st of 2021, ultimately our board kind of put the pause on the whole thing because of a couple of reasons. Number one, we didn't have the 2020 census data out. So those areas we were looking at were based on 2010. So we needed to wait because we learned that the state would be using the 2020 census data. So we needed to have those numbers, which didn't come out till later on in 2021. And then the other thing was, I think at the time, SB 619 had been introduced, and we were waiting to see what was going to happen with that and what might be included in that. So the board did put the pause on that. I would certainly invite you, if you want to, you can go to the county's website and watch the June 1st hearing, and you'll get to hear some of the comments from residents and just, particularly in our mountain areas again. On the subject of bears, I think I heard comments from those folks that came to that hearing saying they came loaded for bear because they were not happy. And I would also add on the bear comment, your comments to the 4,500 foot elevation are absolutely appropriate. I can tell you that in a very popular vacationing spot in Madera County at Bass Lake, which is about 3,400 feet, we have a significant bear problem with trash. In fact, I was just dealing with it before I came on this call. because it's all over the place due to bears getting into it. So yes, they don't stay above 4,500 feet. That is absolutely sure. I can guarantee you that. So, in general, I would just say that, and Staci touched on a lot of these things, the uniqueness of the rural counties, and, the different ways that people live really and operate. Just, it's something that, again, the cause for reducing methane in landfills and this approach, I don't think anybody, disagrees with that. And, it does need to be addressed. But when you look at the numbers, as Staci mentioned, and the percent of organics that come from these rural agencies and the effort that it's going to take for, rural agencies to implement these regulations, it's pretty staggering. I always talk to people and ask them, if they live in the city, do they have 3-cart service already? And most of the time the answer is always yes. And the difference between educating folks who have 3 carts about where to put your organic waste in this cart and dispose of it in that way versus having to actually create that service, get all the equipment, get all the materials, get all the staffing, all the resources, and then figure out where you're going to take it. Because as I mentioned, we don't have a facility in Madera County, so we're taking it out of county to even get rid of it. And in some cases that's 45 minutes to an hour from where we're collecting, the waste, especially in the mountain areas.
Right. So you got to calculate in your greenhouse gas.
Correct.
And Commissioner Garcetti has his hand up.
Yeah, Jared and Staci, this has been fascinating for me because I was one, and probably others who were on the commission, they were born and raised in a city. I never lived in a rural area. So you really have informed me tremendously. And some of what you have raised, both of you, Jared and Staci, seems to be common sense in terms of what should be done. But yet you're fighting to get some of this done. I mean, when you talk about narrow roads that, that big trucks can't come down a narrow road, or bears coming down to 3,400 feet, they probably go lower than that. They're in Pasadena area here sometimes. So, don't give me 4,500 feet here, but where are you getting the pushback? Is this from legislators? Is it from the state? Who is giving you the pushback on this? Jared, do you want to answer that first?
It's probably going to be Cal Recycle.
Well, all right, you said it. No, yeah, I mean, honestly, it is, it is Cal Recycle, and I would just say that I understand that, they have jobs and they're trying to implement the regulations and the things that have been put in place. So, I mean, it is, I mean, for me, it's tough conversations we have because, they're just trying to do their job and, we're just trying to do our job. But, like I said, one of the things that's is a challenge is local agency and really not just this, but other regulations too that come out, from state to federal, whatever they may be. We're the people who touch the people. We are directly talking to these people. They're coming to us. And it is very, very challenging. I mean, when you talk about confidence in government, it's tough. It is tough to sit in front of these folks and try to explain to them that, it's not the county that's doing this. I mean, I heard that over and over again from folks on our calls. It just, why is the county doing this? Why are you making us do this? Again, shortly after the COVID era, so there was all kinds of you shall and you must do things for COVID, right? Well, then you tack this onto it and it's like, what's next? So it absolutely is. And again, Cal Recycle, I understand they're doing their job. It's unfortunate that, I feel like it's unfortunate that some of the early conversation that RCRC and those folks, that team tried to have to help sort of, bring these things up and try to consider those in the regulation development process. Some of it just didn't get heard or went unheard. And, you know, in my opinion, it's almost like you really needed to have almost two different regulations, a rural and a urban regulation, so that you could really distinguish that. And then that way you're not concerned about whether or not a city's going to try to, you know, jump on board with maybe some of the exemptions when they maybe really don't apply, you know. So I mean, that's just, hopefully that
I hear a question for you, because maybe everyone else knows the answer to this, but who does Cal Recycle report to? Who's their boss?
So Cal Recycle reports to Cal EPA. They're part of the Cal EPA chain, which then reports to the governor.
Okay. All right, so the governor hasn't weighed in on this, I assume?
Not officially.
What about unofficially?
We've had some chats with some of the staff who has been deferred back to Cal Recycle. So,
well, it's troubling to me if you have some appointed officials who do not report to the people per se. An elected official, for example, is going to be paying attention to this. I'm not sure always that appointed officials pay the same kind of attention to the public. And so this might be something that I hope we hear at our next meeting. Will it be someone there from Cal Recycle at our next meeting?
Commissioner Garcetti, there will be. We will be hearing from the director of Cal Recycle at the next meeting, and we have invited other administration officials as well.
We've invited. Okay, we'll see who shows up. Thanks.
Correct.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take a look at, before I leave, Jared, was that pretty much your presentation?
Yeah, no, I think I covered, and you know, like Staci covered a lot of stuff. I guess just the one other thing I was going to add real quick in terms of, you know, potential opportunities or suggestions. You know, there are other ways that we know of to deal with methane emissions from landfills. You know, lots of landfills have gas to energy systems and things like that. And, you know, if there was an opportunity to maybe look at those as options for, you know, methane emission reduction, as opposed to actually having to do an organics collection, you know, those are things that, you know, possibly might be alternatives that could be looked at. I'm not aware that there are any at this time in terms of 1383 and emissions reductions, but you know, I understand that you know, ultimately a lot of this kind of initiated or originated through the California Air Resources Board and their involvement with, you know, the air quality, right? Which makes sense. You know, they have you know, there's a lot of different things that they look at in terms of air quality stuff, but you know, this is what you know, like I said, this is what we're trying to deal with and get this put in place as best we can, but it is definitely a challenge for sure. You know, as I mentioned, with all that needs to be done, but also helping people understand why and, you know, what the benefit is. So I appreciate your time and thank you for allowing me to share.
Of course. And I also think that part of what we've got to look at as a commission is what are the alternatives for a county that doesn't have a facility to process the organics? I mean, you know, it's like if you live in LA or Pasadena, Glendale, or wherever, there's a facility. It's part of what's already, you know, the infrastructure. But when you live in a place that doesn't have that as part of the infrastructure, what sort of accommodations are available to help you resolve the problem? I mean, the goal should be, right? You've got 1383. The objective is to do a certain thing to accomplish a particular goal. It always seemed to me that there ought to be room for a variety of solutions that are compatible with what a jurisdiction is capable of doing. And I see Staci, you've unmuted.
Yeah, and right now what we're looking at is just putting more trucks on the road to haul the materials to facilities further away. I don't think that's a very good solution.
Right. Well, unless they're electric trucks.
You're right.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Anyway, I want to thank you, Jared. Any other questions or comments from commissioners? Not seeing any. Let me get back then to Ethan. Oh, Jared, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Commissioner. I was just going to make one more comment on the trucks on the road. So while you could drive electric trucks for emissions, I just wanted to point out that still is a strain on local agencies, because that's a wear and tear and a hit on our transportation infrastructure. So there's other,
Right.
I guess we'll say residual impacts to this stuff too as well, not just specifically the air quality.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. All right, to Ethan.
And now, Mr. Chairman, I actually see that Commissioner Byer
David
just
Byer.
raised his hand. Commissioner
Yeah, David.
Byer.
Defend Cal Recycle
Now
just
you're
a second. Even though I was critical of them before, let's be realistic. There are some counties themselves that are divided in terms of both wealth and topography, geography. Placer County, which includes Tahoe, also includes deeply rural areas. So they have a difficult job. And one of the, I guess, frustrating things from what we've heard from the food banks and from the rural counties and the witnesses we heard from earlier in the year is that there isn't a lot of certainty with respect to the regulatory process and how this is going to be financed. And so at a higher altitude, the idea that this is going to be imposed on ratepayers is going to produce, my view, a political implementation problem of a significant magnitude. And therefore, the regulatory friction that we're hearing about from stakeholders in the rural areas or in the food banks is an irritant that's going to get in the way of implementing the larger, bigger, bolder goal that the legislature had in mind. And I think as we look forward to the state officials, we should keep that in mind as well as the specific individual problems we've heard about.
Yep, good points. Good points. Thank you. All right, Ethan.
Mr. Chairman, with that, I believe someone is, I think that was just some noise.
Background, okay.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, we have concluded the witnesses. Will now move to the public comment period of the agenda. So I'll ask the staff to put up the instructions for public comment. For members of the public who wish to make comment, please note that in keeping with traditional commission practice, your comments are limited to 3 minutes per speaker. And when you are speaking, the commissioners will be able to hear you, but they will not be able to see you. If you have joined the meeting by Zoom, use the raised hand function. So raise your hand now to indicate you wish to make public comment. If you have phoned into the meeting, send an email and do it right now to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. That address is on the screen, littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. Include your phone number so we know who to unmute when you are called upon. But if possible, just use the raised hand function to indicate you wish to make public comment. And again, 3 minutes per speaker. You will be heard, but you will not be seen by the commissioners. With that, I'll ask Ashley if we have anyone who has indicated they wish to make public comment.
Yes, we have a few requests for public comment. We're going to start with Kelvin Garvain. Kelvin, I'm turning on your ability to talk.
Thank you for hosting this public hearing. I'm fascinated by the information that was shared. I'm not a farmer. I have worked in the rural area in Toyabe County near, Pickle Meadow, where there's a Marine Corps base. However, I'm here in Los Angeles. Finding the people who need food, I think, can be done by looking at zip codes. Zip codes, they transcend council districts, assembly districts, supervisory districts. Commissioner Garcetti knows that some of the large thoroughfares like Slauson, Figueroa, Crenshaw, Normandy, Western can be points of issue, can be points of departure for vehicles that can go to some of these, especially what I call mom and pop NGOs that are trying to give food out because of what's happening now with this quote unquote post-COVID environment. In terms of the rural areas, I think it's a good idea to maybe look at having rural as well as urban guidelines. Methane gas, this also comes from different kinds of farming. So perhaps in the future, CalRecycle can look at, or even USDA can look at how to reduce methane, because 1383 is about short-lived climate pollutants, and methane is the worst or the most toxic, to look at how that can actually be considered with people who might be in rural and be in the business of agriculture. Finally, I think it's critical to think about the waste haulers. And what's happening across America is consolidation in the waste business. Some of the larger companies are becoming multi-billion-dollar enterprises. And I think in particular here in Los Angeles County, they can play a bigger role in perhaps not earning as many profits, but actually putting some of that money back into mitigation of education and awareness about what people buy, what people donate, what people throw away. I can't say enough how much Assembly Bill 954 is important, because it really helps consumers as well as retailers understand what to put out to face consumers and also what to donate. That's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Calvin. Next up, we have Sharon Byrne. Sharon, I'm turning on your ability to talk.
Thank you so much. And what a great hearing, great opportunity to listen in. I'm super appreciative of this. I've been listening in from a number of different levels, but one that is very intriguing to me is trying to do something about the problem of methane. And yes, it is kind of one of the worst of the climate gases. Been noticing that there are parts of the country and parts of the world that are very focused on regenerative agriculture, meaning that you let some land go fallow for a little bit to rest and recuperate and build up its ability to do water capture and also carbon capture, right? And part of doing the carbon capture is taking organic waste and putting it on the land, letting it become part of the soil and using organic waste, if you will, to recharge and regenerate the soil and put more carbon into the soil and out of the atmosphere. I know the bill didn't go that far in trying to do that, but it is a direction that a lot of countries are taking in order to reduce climate change and reduce methane gases and divert organic waste from going into landfills and becoming methane gas. But really fascinating hearing, and I look forward to the next one. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Sharon. We have no additional requests for public comment on Zoom or via email.
Thank you, Ashley. I believe then, Mr. Chairman, we have concluded the agenda for today.
Yep, thank you very much. Let me, Crystal, so do we have some direction about where we're going on the next meeting? Maybe Ethan and Crystal could
We
give
do.
us
If I may just respond, Mr. Chairman, we do. So at the next hearing on September 8th, 2 weeks from today, we will be hearing, as I said, from state officials from CalRecycle, and we have invited other administration officials as well. We're still working to secure their testimony. And then on September 22nd, we will be holding an advisory committee roundtable, including particularly with members of industry, although with other stakeholders as well, to talk about these issues then. So we will definitely hear from state officials at the next meeting. We don't know exactly who yet.
Okay, very good. So let me quick scan of the commissioners. Any closing remarks or comments before we close off our hearing? Seeing none, once again, gratitude to Crystal for putting the program together. Thank you very much. Thanks to staff for making sure that everything ran technologically fine. Ethan, it was good to see you. And my friends, we'll get together September 8th. Be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.